The essence of designing a hairline in men involves basically two main concepts: the actual location and shape of the hairline, but then also the actual design, the way the hair grafts are placed into the hairline to create a natural look. I'm going to go through some case examples where I can talk about some of the elements that I utilized, showing how I approach early male pattern hair loss, more advanced male pattern hair loss, even some reference to different ethnicities, or at least the characteristics of hair, because that is a relevant concept as well. So in this first patient we see, this was a young patient, guy in his mid-20s, had early thinning. You can see the before photos. And the thinning proceeded or progressed into the frontal forelock region. And you can see what I was able to achieve in a single procedure of around 800 to 900 grafts, reinforcing the frontal forelock and also creating a nice irregularity. And you can see that micro irregularity within his hairline. We talk about a macro irregularity and we talk about a micro irregularity, and I'll be showing this when I make actual recipient sites. But the micro irregularity refers to the areas of thicker and thinner that go right within the hairline. And the macro irregularity is the up and down nature of the actual hairline, because we don't want a pure line. We actually want something that's nice and irregular. And we create that irregularity not just in terms of how the hairline sort of scallops or is wavy, but also in terms of how the hairline varies in density. So you can see once again with this patient that what I was able to achieve approximately a year later was irregularity of his hairline, both in terms of the areas where it gets thicker and thinner. The next case is of an Asian gentleman. Asian hair is always more challenging. It's particularly important when doing Asian hair to use primarily single hair and some two-hair grafts when appropriate. And in this case, I was able to lower this hairline in a guy in his late 20s. I was able to lower his hairline by just about 2/3 of an inch. Around 16 millimeters, and you can see how nicely the hairline was able to come down. He had a quite straight hairline. I was able to bring it down. Positioning the hairline, I like to go somewhere where the vertical forehead meets up with the horizontal scalp, somewhere in that distance. When it goes higher than that, that's when a hairline looks receded, and that's what makes this gentleman's hairline, even though it's only 9.5 centimeters above his nose, it looks somewhat receded. By bringing it down to a little under 9 centimeters above the root of his nose, you can see we created a nice, much more natural, a more youthful looking hairline. And you can see once again the slight irregularity close up on the hairlines. This is an example of a gentleman. This next case is a guy in his early to mid-40s. He's got a little more advanced degree of hair loss. And here you can see him not just post-op day one, where you can actually see the little irregularity, but also the long-term results of a procedure of around 1,500 grafts. And you can see once again that his hairline is lower. Most importantly, it's fuller. He wasn't looking so much as lowering. We did a bit of lowering, but primarily it was designed to create a denser hairline, which I was able to do by working very carefully within the existing hairlines. Some gentlemen will want a filling in as well of the temples, and I made reference before, I try to avoid much temple work, except on guys over the age of 35, 40, because as the patient gets older, he's likely to recede. So in this case, I created a flatter hairline, still staying no more than horizontal on the Frankfurt horizontal plane. So instead of having the hairline go down like this, instead I created a nice horizontal line, and then you can see where I brought forward his temples, creating a less of a recession, which is a particularly important area for patients. Note too that transition zone where the frontal hairline meets up with the temple zone is where hairs are going to grow more in an angled direction. That's another element to create more naturalness. Whenever you're doing a hair restoration, is proper hair growth direction. So it's not just the micro irregularity, but also the direction of hairs. And you'll see when I make recipient sites, as you can see here with me making the recipient sites, I'm angling the hair, the blade at a rather acute position from the forehead skin or the scalp skin, so we get the hairs to grow primarily in a forward direction. So here anyway, you can go ahead and see another example of a gentleman with a more advanced degree of hair loss where his entire frontal region is thinned out. And in his case, I'm going ahead and filling it in within the existing hairline. You can see the results that I achieved, and you can see once again that irregularity of the hairline, and this was a procedure that was designed to fill in the frontal hairline. In guys with more advanced degrees of hair loss, a guy in his early 40s, now he has curly hair, so with curly hair it's much less important to use all single hair grafts along the hairline. You can actually place 2 hair grafts and it will look natural. In this gentleman I did use some single hair grafts, mostly 2s, and then 3 hair grafts further back, and I created a little bit of an irregularity, and you can see the results that we can achieve, creating a conservative frontal forelock at the uppermost point where the vertical forehead would start to transition into the or at the end of its transition point where it goes into the horizontal scalp. In patients with a rather advanced degree of hair loss, the approach is to do a frontal forelock. You can see here in the illustration, the pre-op, I've drawn in a diamond-shaped area where I'm going to concentrate the majority of the 2 and 3 hair grafts to create the greatest density, and then I surround it with sort of an extended feathering zone which can connect up with his temporal horns, which are rather high, and then also along the hairline where I've created more feathering. You can see on the lateral view where he's got the strong frontal forelock, which then serves to frame the face. In this case, the hairs grow in a downward direction, but I built up the temporal horns. This way, the frontal forelock had no problem meeting up with the sides or the temple by building it up, and that's an effective mechanism for creating a more youthful look and not having an isolated frontal forelock in those patients with more advanced degrees of hair loss. The importance of staying conservative is nicely illustrated when designing a hairline in this patient. Patient originally came to me 16 years ago. He was in his mid to late 20s. I did a transplant procedure going quite conservatively, and you can see his before photo, which showed quite a degree of thinning. I then went ahead and primarily focused on restoring his frontal forelock. Well, 16 years later, he came back, and you can see his after. At 16 years, I had only done that one procedure. He had no other prior work, and he still has a natural look, because I basically was able to stay conservatively when designing his hairline. When you're evaluating donor areas, and I just show this one example, this was a gentleman, you can see the degree of hair loss he has developed in his lower back of his scalp region. This is not that uncommon. This is a little more dramatic, but in some patients they will have an elevation up of the neck hairline, and this will thus interfere or reduce the total donor supply of grafts as this patient gets older. So maybe 8 years ago when he was in his early 30s, he looked like he had a pretty good amount of donor hair. Well, 8 to 10 years later, he's lost as much as 15%, 20% of that donor hair due to upward migration of his lower hairline. In addition, the crown will also descend downwards. So that's an important factor when evaluating the hairline and when evaluating donor supply to determine how much grafts you'll be able to obtain. Finally, when a hairline's been transplanted too low, and you can see that rounded out look, which just is unnatural, these grafts had to be removed. This was done elsewhere, this first procedure. He came to me, and in this case, I removed around 600 grafts, each one at a time, to create a more receded hairline, and these removed grafts were then transplanted higher up. So this is an example of what can happen if a hairline is not properly designed and it's too rounded. And this is another example. Gentleman had his hairline placed significantly too low, and below that blue line are all the grafts that I removed, and you can see, as before with his long hair, 2 photos showing, the photo showing the areas of the grafts that were removed below the blue line, and then this is how nicely it healed up at around 3 months post-op. The hairs that were removed that were retransplanted have not started growing yet, but you can see how nicely this area healed up to show how these hairlines grafts can sometimes need to be removed. So it's so important when designing a hairline, keeping so many factors in mind: donor supply, patient's age, the shape of their head, how much hair loss they will eventually develop on the top of their head. whether temples should be restored. So these are all factors that go into the designing of a hairline. And then other factors, the micro decisions that are made with the hairline, how to make it look irregular, how to angulate the hairs, and also how to create zones of thicker and thinner areas or clumping of hairs, which is achieved when the surgeon is actively involved with the procedure.